Dad, you know nothing about business. Kevin's words echoed through Frank Richardson's modest living room like a slap across the face. The 72-year-old grandfather sat frozen in his worn recliner, laptop balanced on his knees, spreadsheet still glowing on the screen. 6 months of secret planning, countless hours of research, and this was the response from his own son? Not curiosity, not support, just brutal dismissal wrapped in condescending laughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's weathered fingers trembled slightly as he closed the laptop, cutting off the presentation he'd spent weeks perfecting. The digital consulting proposal vanished from view, taking with it months of carefully calculated projections and market analysis. Kevin stood near the fireplace, still wearing his expensive suit from another day at Meridian Corporate Solutions, his silk tie loosened just enough to suggest the casual arrogance of middle management success. "You've completely lost touch with reality," Kevin continued, pacing across the hardwood floors that Dorothy had polished so lovingly before her passing 3 years ago. "Digital consulting? At your age? Do you even know what cloud computing means?" His voice carried that particular brand of cruelty that only family members can inflict, the kind that cuts deepest because it comes wrapped in claimed concern. Frank had anticipated resistance, but not outright mockery. He'd imagined Kevin might express caution about the financial risks or worry about his father taking on too much stress in retirement. Instead, he faced complete dismissal of his capabilities, as if his 70 decades of life experience counted for nothing in the modern business world. The irony burned like acid in Frank's chest. For the past 2 years, while Kevin assumed his father spent retirement days watching television and tending his small garden, Frank had been quietly educating himself. Online courses in digital marketing, YouTube tutorials on business automation, late-night reading sessions about e-commerce platforms and social media strategies. The factory supervisor who'd managed teams and budgets for 43 years had been secretly transforming himself into something Kevin couldn't even recognize. "I've been studying this industry for months," Frank said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotional storm brewing inside. "Small businesses in Cedar Falls are struggling with digital transformation. They need help with online presence, automated systems, customer relationship management." Kevin's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Studying? Dad, you can barely operate your smartphone without calling me for help. You think reading a few articles makes you qualified to compete with actual tech companies?" He gestured toward the window overlooking Main Street, where several empty storefronts bore silent testimony to economic challenges. "Those businesses are failing because they're obsolete, not because they need some amateur consultant." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to feel credible. Frank did occasionally struggle with his phone's more complex features. He had needed Kevin's help setting up his email on the new tablet last Christmas. But those surface difficulties masked a deeper truth that Kevin refused to see. Frank's generation hadn't grown up with technology, but that didn't mean they couldn't master it when motivated by genuine need and curiosity. "I'm not some amateur," Frank replied, opening the laptop again, despite Kevin's obvious impatience. "Look at these numbers. Local businesses lose an average of 30% of potential customers because they lack proper online systems. I can provide solutions that cost a fraction of what big consultant firms charge." Kevin moved closer, peering at the screen with the expression of someone humoring a child's fantasy game. His eyes scanned the carefully researched data, the competitive analysis, the projected revenue streams that Frank had compiled through weeks of methodical investigation. But instead of recognizing the thoroughness of the preparation, Kevin saw only confirmation of his father's delusions. "These are meaningless numbers pulled from generic industry reports," Kevin said, tapping the screen dismissively. "Real business requires understanding market dynamics, client psychology, operational scalability. You've never run anything more complex than a household budget." Frank felt heat rising in his chest, the same anger that had once helped him handle difficult situations on the factory floor. Kevin's assessment ignored 4 decades of supervisory experience, budget management, process improvement, and team leadership. Being a factory supervisor might not have involved PowerPoint presentations or quarterly board meetings, but it had required every business skill Kevin now claimed his father lacked. "I managed teams of 50 people," Frank said, his voice gaining strength. "I controlled budgets exceeding $2 million annually. I implemented efficiency improvements that saved the company hundreds of thousands in operating costs. That experience translates to any business environment." Kevin shook his head with theatrical patience, the kind reserved for elderly relatives who needed gentle correction. "Dad, following company procedures isn't the same as entrepreneurship. You had a steady paycheck, guaranteed benefits, union protection. Real business means risking everything with no safety net. It requires innovation, adaptability, technological sophistication that, frankly, your generation just doesn't possess." The condescension in Kevin's tone revealed something darker than mere skepticism. This wasn't protective concern for his father's well-being or legitimate worry about financial risk. This was generational arrogance, the assumption that technological fluency automatically translated to business wisdom. Kevin saw his father as a relic from an obsolete era, incapable of understanding modern commercial realities. Frank closed the laptop again, recognizing that no amount of data or logical argument would penetrate Kevin's preconceptions. His son had already decided that age disqualified him from business success, that experience meant nothing without the right generational credentials. The conversation had transformed from family discussion into a verdict delivered by someone who considered himself uniquely qualified to judge others' capabilities. "What does Sarah think about this scheme?" Kevin asked, invoking his wife's name like additional evidence for his position. "Have you considered how this affects your grandchildren when you lose the house trying to play entrepreneur?" The mention of Emma and Jake hit its intended target. Frank adored his grandchildren, treasured their weekend visits, and would never deliberately jeopardize their security. But Kevin's implication was clear. Pursuing this business venture was inherently selfish, risking family stability for personal gratification. The grandfather who claimed to love his family would prove it by abandoning dreams that might threaten their inheritance. "I've calculated every risk," Frank said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "The initial investment is modest. I'm using money from my savings, not touching the house or pension." Kevin's expression suggested that modest investments could still lead to catastrophic losses, that savings represented security rather than seed capital for untested ventures. His worldview allowed no space for calculated risks or measured entrepreneurship after age 70. Business success belonged to younger generations who understood technology instinctively, rather than learning it through determined effort. The living room fell silent except for the grandfather clock's persistent ticking, marking time that Kevin clearly believed his father was wasting on impossible dreams. Frank stared at the laptop, containing months of research and planning, wondering if his son's harsh assessment contained wisdom he was too proud to acknowledge. Perhaps digital consulting really was beyond his capabilities.
Perhaps Kevin was protecting him from inevitable humiliation and financial disaster. But something deeper than wounded pride resisted that conclusion. Frank had spent 2 years secretly studying this industry not from boredom or fantasy, but because he recognized genuine opportunity. Small businesses were indeed struggling with digital transformation, paying excessive fees to consulting firms that delivered generic solutions. His combination of traditional business experience and newly acquired technical knowledge could provide exactly what these companies needed. Kevin's dismissal didn't negate market realities or eliminate Frank's carefully developed expertise. "You'll see," Frank said quietly, more to himself than to his son. "I may be 72, but I understand business better than you think." Kevin gathered his coat and briefcase with a satisfied air of someone who'd successfully talked sense into a confused relative. "Dad, please reconsider this before you make any irreversible decisions. Talk to your financial advisor. Get a second opinion from someone objective. Don't let pride drive you toward a mistake that could affect the whole family." The front door closed with finality that felt like judgment rendered. Frank sat alone in his living room, surrounded by the comfortable furniture and familiar photographs that represented decades of careful, conservative living.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Dorothy's presence lingered in every carefully arranged detail, reminding him of shared dreams that had been postponed for practical responsibilities and family obligations. They'd always planned to travel, to take risks, to pursue adventures after retirement. Her death had stolen those opportunities, but perhaps it had also freed him to attempt something she would have supported, despite its risks. Frank reopened the laptop and stared at his business plan. Kevin's words echoed in his memory, but they couldn't erase months of methodical preparation or eliminate the genuine market need he'd identified. Small businesses in Cedar Falls really did need help with digital transformation. His research was solid, his financial projections realistic, his competitive analysis thorough. Age might bring physical limitations, but it also provided perspectives that younger consultants often lacked. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and continued skepticism from family members who preferred his dreams to remain safely theoretical. But tonight belonged to quiet determination and the recognition that some opportunities wouldn't wait for family approval. Frank had spent 43 years following other people's expectations and priorities. Perhaps it was finally time to trust his own judgment about what the remaining years might accomplish. The morning after Kevin's dismissal, Frank Richardson sat at his kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad. Dorothy's handwriting still graced the refrigerator calendar, marking appointments she would never keep. But Frank had learned to find comfort rather than sorrow in these remnants of their shared life. Today marked the beginning of something she would have supported, even if their son refused to understand. Frank pulled out his smartphone and opened the note-taking app he'd mastered during his secret education period. His first call would be to Cedar Falls Community Bank, where he'd maintained accounts for 37 years. The loan officer, Patricia Huang, had known Frank since her own father worked alongside him at the manufacturing plant. Personal relationships still mattered in smaller communities, even when pursuing cutting-edge business ventures. "Good morning, Patricia. This is Frank Richardson. I'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss a business loan for a consulting venture." His voice carried newfound confidence, strengthened by Kevin's opposition rather than weakened by it. Sometimes the strongest motivation came from proving critics wrong, especially when those critics carried the weight of family expectations. Patricia's surprised pause lasted only a moment before professional warmth replaced personal curiosity. "Of course, Mr. Richardson. What type of consulting are you considering?"
Her tone suggested genuine interest rather than polite indulgence, perhaps because she'd witnessed Frank's methodical approach to every financial decision over nearly 4 decades. "Digital transformation consulting for small businesses. I've prepared comprehensive market analysis and financial projections." Frank had learned to lead with credibility rather than age, letting expertise speak before allowing preconceptions to form. "I can provide detailed documentation of startup costs, revenue forecasts, and competitive positioning." The appointment was set for the following Thursday morning. Frank spent the intervening days refining his presentation, printing supporting documents, and researching Patricia's background to understand her lending priorities. The former factory supervisor approached business development with the same systematic precision that had made him successful in manufacturing management. His second call went to the Small Business Administration office in nearby Columbus. The representative, Michael Torres, explained various loan guarantee programs and mentorship opportunities available to new entrepreneurs. Age never entered the conversation, only business viability and financial requirements. Frank scheduled a consultation meeting and requested informational packets about startup assistance programs. Wednesday morning brought Frank to the office of Rebecca Martinez, a commercial real estate agent who specialized in downtown Cedar Falls properties. The former Radio Shack location on Main Street had caught his attention during his market research phase. The 1,200-square-foot space offered street visibility, adequate parking, and rent within his projected budget parameters. "This property has excellent potential for professional services," Rebecca explained as they walked through the empty storefront. "Previous tenant left it in good condition. Updated electrical, reliable internet infrastructure, separate entrance for client privacy." She gestured toward the back office area where Frank envisioned conducting strategy sessions with small business owners. Frank examined every detail with practiced efficiency. Lighting adequate for computer work, space sufficient for meeting areas, location convenient for downtown business district clients. His factory experience had taught him to evaluate operational requirements before committing to any physical space. "What's the lease structure?" Frank asked, notebook ready to capture essential information. Rebecca outlined terms that aligned with his financial projections. 2-year initial commitment with renewal options, modest security deposit, tenant improvement allowance that would cover basic renovations. "I'll need to complete financing arrangements before signing," Frank explained. "Can you hold this property for 2 weeks while I finalize loan approval?" Rebecca agreed, recognizing serious interest from someone who asked intelligent questions rather than romantic dreamers who focused on aesthetics over practicality. Thursday's bank meeting exceeded Frank's cautious expectations. Patricia reviewed Frank's business plan with thoroughness that suggested genuine lending consideration rather than courtesy toward a long-term customer. His financial projections impressed her, particularly the conservative approach to startup costs and realistic timeline for profitability. "Your market analysis is exceptionally detailed," Patricia observed, studying Frank's competitive research. "Most loan applicants provide generic industry data, but you've identified specific gaps in local service provision." She appreciated the methodical approach that characterized Frank's entire presentation. Frank had spent weeks analyzing every business consultant operating within 50 miles of Cedar Falls. Most focused on broad strategy rather than practical implementation. None specialized in digital transformation for businesses with fewer than 20 employees. His positioning offered clear differentiation without requiring massive capital investment. "What's your background in consulting?" Patricia asked, the question Frank had anticipated and prepared for extensively. 43 years supervising manufacturing operations taught me process improvement, team management, and operational efficiency. I've spent 2 years studying digital marketing, automation systems, and online business platforms." Patricia's expression reflected growing confidence in Frank's preparation. "Your credit history is excellent, debt-to-income ratio well within our parameters. Collateral position looks strong with the house value." She pulled out preliminary loan application forms. "I think we can structure something that meets your needs." The next hour involved detailed financial documentation, tax returns from recent years, bank statements showing consistent savings patterns, pension verification letters, property appraisals confirming home value. Frank had assembled everything in organized folders, demonstrating the systematic approach that would characterize his business operations. "Assuming property appraisal confirms stated values, we should have loan approval within 10 business days," Patricia concluded. "Your application will receive serious consideration. The preparation quality and financial stability are impressive." She walked Frank to the lobby, shaking hands with genuine warmth rather than polite dismissal. Driving home, Frank felt validation that had nothing to do with family approval. Professional evaluation of his business concept had produced encouragement rather than skepticism. Patricia's positive response proved that thorough preparation could overcome age-related prejudices when dealing with objective decision-makers. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. Kevin's name appeared on the caller ID, prompting Frank to consider whether this conversation would differ from their previous encounter. He answered with cautious optimism, hoping his son might have reconsidered his harsh dismissal. "Dad, I've been thinking about our discussion," Kevin began, his tone carrying residual condescension despite apparent attempts at diplomatic softness. "Maybe we should explore some safer alternatives. Sarah suggested you might enjoy teaching computer classes at the senior center, sharing your knowledge without financial risk." Frank parked and remained seated, processing his son's underlying assumptions. Teaching seniors represented acceptable use of his technology skills because it involved no real business risk or potential for significant success. Kevin could support his father's digital literacy as long as it remained safely contained within age-appropriate boundaries. "I appreciate the suggestion," Frank replied carefully, "but I'm pursuing the consulting business. I had a positive meeting with the bank today. Loan approval looks promising."
He waited for Kevin's response, hoping professional validation might shift his son's perspective. "Dad, banks approve loans for anyone with collateral. That doesn't mean the business will succeed." Kevin's voice carried familiar impatience with his father's persistence. "Senior centers need volunteers with your patience and experience. Why risk everything on some untested venture when you could contribute meaningfully to your peer group?" The conversation revealed Kevin's fundamental inability to envision his father succeeding in competitive business environments. Teaching other seniors felt appropriately modest, while consulting for actual companies seemed dangerously ambitious. Kevin wanted his father engaged and active, but only within limitations that confirmed generational stereotypes. "I understand your concerns," Frank said, opening his front door and stepping into the living room where his laptop waited with additional research to complete. "But I'm committed to this path. I've identified genuine market opportunities and developed expertise to address them." Kevin's frustrated sigh carried clearly through the phone connection. "Fine, but when this fantasy collapses, don't expect me to solve the financial problems it creates."
"I warned you about the risks." The call ended without goodbyes, leaving Frank alone with renewed determination rather than discouragement. Evening brought time for additional preparation. Frank opened his laptop and continued developing client acquisition strategies. Local business directories provided contact information for potential customers. Chamber of Commerce membership lists identified decision-makers who might need digital transformation assistance. His methodical approach to business development reflected decades of problem-solving experience. Factory supervision had required analyzing complex situations, identifying root causes, implementing systematic solutions. Consulting would demand identical skills applied to different challenges. Kevin's dismissal couldn't erase 4 decades of proven capability in demanding professional environments. Frank created spreadsheets tracking potential clients, service offerings, pricing structures, and implementation timelines. His business plan evolved from theoretical framework into operational blueprint with specific milestones and measurable objectives. Success would require systematic execution rather than wishful thinking, precisely the kind of challenge that had energized him throughout his manufacturing career. The grandfather clock chimed 10 o'clock, marking another day of progress toward independence from family expectations. Dorothy's photograph smiled from the mantelpiece, reminding Frank of dreams they'd shared but never pursued due to practical responsibilities. Perhaps her memory would bless this late career adventure that honored their suppressed entrepreneurial spirits. Tomorrow would bring continued preparation for the venture that Kevin considered impossible. Property lease negotiations, equipment procurement, marketing material development, and client identification activities that would transform digital consulting from concept into reality. Frank closed his laptop with satisfaction that had nothing to do with family approval and everything to do with personal fulfillment finally within reach. Frank Richardson stood outside his newly leased office space on Main Street, keys trembling in his weathered hands as October rain drummed against the windows of Richardson Digital Solutions. 6 months of methodical preparation had led to this moment. The loan had been approved, equipment installed, business licenses obtained, and marketing materials printed. Everything was ready for his first day serving the Cedar Falls business community. The storefront looked professional despite its modest size. Fresh paint covered the walls, modern furniture filled the reception area, and state-of-the-art computer equipment occupied the consultation room where he would demonstrate digital solutions to skeptical business owners. Frank had invested 3 weeks perfecting the office layout, ensuring every detail would inspire confidence in his capabilities. Linda Chen arrived at 8 sharp, her enthusiasm evident despite the early hour. Frank had hired her as his administrative assistant after she responded to his carefully crafted job posting. Her background in customer service and basic computer skills made her ideal for managing client communications while he focused on technical implementations. "Everything looks incredible, Mr. Richardson," Linda said, hanging her coat in the small closet he designated as staff space. "The phone system is working perfectly, and I've organized the client folders according to your specifications."
Her professional demeanor reminded Frank why he'd chosen her over younger candidates with flashier credentials but less genuine commitment. Marcus Thompson knocked on the front door precisely at 8:30, carrying the laptop bag that contained his portfolio of web development projects. At 28, Marcus possessed the technical fluency Frank had acquired through determined study, but he approached his work with respectful collaboration rather than generational condescension. Frank had hired him as a part-time contractor to handle the most complex programming tasks while learning everything possible from his expertise. "Ready for our first client meeting?" Marcus asked, setting up his demonstration equipment in the conference area Frank had created near the front windows. Their 10 o'clock appointment with Henderson Hardware represented 6 weeks of careful cultivation, starting with casual conversations during Frank's regular visits to purchase home improvement supplies. Tom Henderson had been struggling with online competition from major retailers, watching his family business lose customers to companies that offered convenient e-commerce and competitive pricing. Frank had spent hours analyzing Tom's specific challenges, developing customized solutions that would leverage the hardware store's local knowledge and personal service advantages. 9:30 arrived with mounting anticipation. Frank reviewed his presentation materials one final time while Linda confirmed that the coffee service was ready for their guest. Marcus tested the projection equipment and internet connection, ensuring no technical difficulties would undermine their carefully orchestrated demonstration. 10 o'clock came and went without Tom Henderson. Frank watched through the front windows as Main Street foot traffic moved past their office without pausing or showing interest in the grand opening signs he posted. 10:15 brought the first wave of concern. Tom was typically punctual for his business appointments, arriving early rather than late for important meetings. Frank dialed Henderson Hardware's number, reaching Tom's wife Margaret, who managed the administrative functions. Her voice carried apologetic embarrassment as she explained the situation. "I'm so sorry, Frank. Tom decided this morning that he's not interested in digital consulting after all. He thinks the hardware business should stick to traditional methods." The cancellation hit harder than Frank had anticipated. Tom Henderson had seemed genuinely interested during their preliminary discussions, asking detailed questions about online marketing and customer database management. His sudden withdrawal felt like personal rejection rather than simple business decision-making. "Did something change his mind?" Frank asked, though he suspected the answer might implicate Kevin's influence within Cedar Falls' business community. His son worked for Meridian Corporate Solutions, which provided services to many local companies. Kevin's dismissive comments about his father's venture might have reached other potential clients. Margaret's hesitation confirmed Frank's suspicions. "Someone told him that digital consulting was too complicated for older business owners, that companies like ours should focus on our core strengths instead of chasing technology trends." Her diplomatic language couldn't disguise the source of Tom's sudden skepticism. The phone call ended with polite pleasantries that failed to mask the underlying disappointment. Frank's first scheduled client had withdrawn based on second-hand advice rather than direct evaluation of the proposed services. Worse, the source of that advice appeared to be his own son, actively undermining his business prospects within the local community. Marcus and Linda attempted to maintain optimistic attitudes, suggesting that other potential clients would prove more receptive to digital transformation opportunities. Frank appreciated their loyalty, but the morning's events had shaken his confidence more than he cared to admit. If Kevin was actively discouraging his business prospects, every client acquisition would become exponentially more difficult. 11 o'clock brought another disappointment. Janet Morrison from Morrison's Boutique called to postpone their scheduled consultation indefinitely. Her explanation echoed Tom Henderson's reasoning almost verbatim. Traditional retail should focus on traditional methods rather than complicated technology initiatives that might confuse established customer bases. Lunch hour passed without any walk-in customers, despite the prominent signage and attractive window displays Frank had arranged to attract spontaneous inquiries. Cedar Falls business owners walked past his office as if it were invisible, focused on their own concerns rather than curious about new service providers in their community. Linda answered occasional phone calls from people requesting information about their services, but these conversations ended quickly when callers learned about the digital focus of Frank's consulting practice. The enthusiasm he detected during his market research phase seemed to have evaporated, replaced by suspicious reluctance that felt orchestrated rather than organic. 2 o'clock brought the most devastating blow. Patricia Huang from Cedar Falls Community Bank called with unexpected urgency in her voice. "Frank, I need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your business plan. Can you come in this afternoon for an emergency meeting?" The drive to the bank felt like a funeral procession. Frank's confidence crumbled with each block, replaced by growing dread about Patricia's mysterious concerns. Emergency meetings rarely delivered positive news, especially when they followed mornings of systematic client cancellations and community rejection. Patricia's office felt different than it had during their previous optimistic discussions. Her professional warmth had been replaced by careful formality that suggested serious problems with his loan arrangement or business approval status. She gestured toward the same chair where he'd sat just weeks earlier, confident about his venture's prospects. "I've received some troubling information about the viability of your business model," Patricia began, consulting notes that hadn't been present during their previous meetings. "Several community members have expressed concerns about digital consulting services being appropriate for Cedar Falls' business environment." Frank felt his stomach sink as Patricia outlined the feedback she'd received. Anonymous sources had questioned whether sufficient demand existed for his services, whether his technical expertise was adequate for professional consulting, and whether his age made him suitable for cutting-edge business advisory roles. "Who provided this information?" Frank asked, though he already suspected the answer. Patricia's diplomatic response confirmed his fears without explicitly naming Kevin. "I can't identify specific sources, but the concerns came from credible business professionals within our community." The loan approval wasn't being revoked, but Patricia wanted reassurance about his business plan's fundamental viability. Market conditions had apparently changed since their original discussions, raising questions about whether digital consulting represented sound investment for both Frank and the bank. Frank attempted to address each concern systematically, providing additional documentation about his technical training and market research findings. But Patricia's questions revealed that someone had planted seeds of doubt that would be difficult to overcome with logic or evidence. The meeting ended with conditional support rather than enthusiastic endorsement. Frank's loan remained active, but Patricia would be monitoring his business performance more closely than originally planned. Any signs of financial difficulty would trigger immediate review of his credit arrangements. Walking back to his office, Frank felt the weight of systematic sabotage that extended beyond simple family disagreement into active business interference. Kevin hadn't merely expressed skepticism about his father's venture. He'd apparently launched a campaign to ensure its failure by poisoning potential client relationships and undermining banking support. Linda and Marcus waited anxiously for his return, their faces reflecting concern about his obviously troubled expression. Frank attempted to maintain leadership composure while explaining the day's developments, but his voice carried defeated undertones that couldn't be entirely suppressed.
Evening brought time for honest assessment of his situation. The office rent was due monthly regardless of client revenue. Equipment costs were fixed expenses that wouldn't disappear if business failed to materialize. Linda and Marcus deserved compensation for their professional commitment, even if his client base remained non-existent. Frank sat alone in his beautiful office, surrounded by expensive equipment and professional furnishings that might represent the costliest mistake of his retirement years. Kevin's warnings about financial disaster seemed prophetic rather than pessimistic, confirmed by a single day's experience in the harsh reality of competitive business environments. Perhaps his son had been right about age-related limitations and market conditions. Perhaps digital consulting really was beyond his capabilities, despite months of determined preparation and systematic planning. The grandfather clock in his living room would continue marking time toward an uncertain future, while Richardson Digital Solutions might become another empty storefront on Main Street's growing collection of failed enterprises. Frank Richardson arrived at his office the following morning with grim determination rather than optimism. The previous day's systematic sabotage had clarified his situation beyond any doubt. Kevin was actively working to destroy his business before it could establish credibility within the Cedar Falls community. But Frank had survived 43 years in manufacturing by solving problems rather than surrendering to them. Linda arrived to find Frank already at his desk, surrounded by printed emails and phone records he'd compiled during a sleepless night of investigation. His methodical approach to understanding the opposition revealed patterns that confirmed his suspicions while suggesting potential countermeasures. "I've identified the source of our client cancellations," Frank announced without preamble. "My son has been contacting potential customers using his position at Meridian Corporate Solutions to discredit our services." He showed Linda the evidence he'd gathered through careful analysis of timing and communication patterns. Marcus listened intently as Frank outlined his strategy for overcoming Kevin's interference. "We're going to bypass the established business network entirely, focus on companies that have no connection to Meridian or the traditional Cedar Falls business community. Target entrepreneurs who are too new to have developed relationships with existing service providers." The plan required complete restructuring of their client acquisition approach, but Frank had identified several promising prospects during his original market research. Startup companies, recent relocations, and businesses owned by newcomers to the area who wouldn't be influenced by Kevin's whisper campaigns. Frank's first call went to Elena Rodriguez, who had recently opened a specialty food importing business in the industrial district south of downtown. Elena had moved to Cedar Falls from Phoenix, bringing expertise in authentic Mexican cuisine ingredients, but struggling to establish online sales channels for her expanding customer base. "I've been looking for someone who understands both traditional business practices and modern digital marketing," Elena explained during their phone conversation. Her enthusiasm felt genuine rather than polite, unmarked by the skepticism Frank had encountered from established Cedar Falls business owners. Their meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, providing Frank with immediate opportunity to demonstrate his capabilities to someone who hadn't been prejudiced against his services. Elena's business represented exactly the type of challenge that played to his strengths: established operational expertise combined with digital transformation needs. The second promising contact came through Marcus's networking within the local startup community. James Wu had recently launched a specialized bicycle repair service, focusing on high-end racing and mountain bikes that required technical expertise beyond typical neighborhood shops.
James needed online booking systems and inventory management solutions that would differentiate his services from generic bike repair businesses. "Age doesn't matter if you understand what I'm trying to achieve," James said when Frank called to introduce his consulting services. "I need someone who grasps both the technical requirements and the business fundamentals. Most consultants focus on one or the other." Frank scheduled a consultation for Friday morning, giving him time to develop customized proposals for both Elena and James. His systematic approach to client needs assessment would demonstrate capabilities that Kevin's sabotage couldn't undermine with second-hand warnings. Wednesday brought unexpected validation from an entirely different source. Dr. Amanda Foster from Columbus State University's Small Business Development Center called in response to Frank's inquiry about their mentor program. She had reviewed his application materials and wanted to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. "Your background is exactly what our program needs," Dr. Foster explained during their phone conversation. "We have many clients who need digital transformation guidance from someone with practical business experience rather than purely academic credentials." She invited Frank to present his services at their monthly entrepreneur workshop. The university connection provided credibility that Kevin's influence couldn't touch. Academic institutions evaluated consultants based on demonstrated expertise rather than age-related prejudices or local business politics. Frank accepted the speaking opportunity eagerly, recognizing its potential for generating referrals from sources beyond Cedar Falls. Thursday afternoon's meeting with Elena Rodriguez exceeded Frank's cautiously optimistic expectations. Her importing business occupied a converted warehouse space that reflected serious commitment to growth rather than casual entrepreneurial dabbling. Inventory systems, shipping documentation, and customer service protocols all demonstrated professional competence that needed digital enhancement rather than fundamental restructuring. Traditional marketing isn't reaching customers outside Ohio, Elena explained, showing Frank her current advertising approaches. I need online presence that showcases product authenticity while providing convenient ordering systems for restaurants and specialty food stores. Frank listened carefully while Elena outlined her specific challenges. His questions revealed understanding of both her industry requirements and the digital solutions that could address them effectively. Unlike Kevin's theoretical dismissals, Frank's consulting approach focused on practical implementation of measurable improvements. I can develop integrated systems that handle inventory tracking, online ordering, customer relationship management, and targeted marketing, Frank proposed, showing Elena preliminary designs he'd prepared based on their phone discussions. Implementation would occur in phases, allowing you to evaluate results before committing to additional features. Elena's positive response felt like vindication of everything Frank had learned during his intensive preparation period. Her business needs matched his capabilities perfectly, creating opportunities for meaningful collaboration that would generate both revenue and referrals for additional clients. Friday morning brought similar success with James Wu's bicycle repair consultation. James had already implemented basic online booking, but he needed sophisticated inventory management and customer communication systems that would support his planned expansion into specialized racing team services. Most consultants want to completely replace my existing systems, James noted appreciatively. You're the first one who suggested building on what's already working rather than starting from scratch.
Frank's approach reflected decades of manufacturing experience, where successful improvements enhanced existing processes rather than disrupting functional operations. The bicycle shop consultation led to immediate contract signing. James needed solutions implemented quickly to support his busy spring season preparation, and Frank's practical timeline impressed him more than flashy promises from younger consultants who overstated their capabilities. Monday morning brought the first significant breakthrough. Elena Rodriguez called with enthusiastic acceptance of Frank's proposal, along with referrals to 3 other importing businesses she'd contacted over the weekend. Word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied clients would prove far more powerful than Kevin's negative whisper campaigns. Dr. Foster's Entrepreneur Workshop drew 43 small business owners to Columbus State's Business Development Center. Frank's presentation focused on practical digital solutions rather than theoretical concepts, demonstrating actual improvements he'd implemented for Elena and James rather than generic case studies. The response exceeded his most optimistic projections. 12 business owners requested individual consultations, 6 signed preliminary service agreements, and Dr. Foster invited Frank to become a regular workshop presenter for their monthly programs. University endorsement provided credibility that transcended local business politics entirely. Within 2 weeks, Richardson Digital Solutions had more client inquiries than Frank could handle alone. Marcus transitioned from part-time contractor to full-time associate, while Linda's administrative responsibilities expanded to include project coordination and client communications management. Frank's systematic approach to service delivery generated exceptional client satisfaction scores. Unlike competitors who overpromised and underdelivered, Frank established realistic expectations and consistently exceeded them through methodical implementation processes that reflected his manufacturing background. The Columbus Business Journal featured Richardson Digital Solutions in their monthly spotlight on innovative small businesses. The article highlighted Frank's unique combination of traditional business experience and modern technical expertise, positioning him as a bridge between generational approaches to entrepreneurship. Local recognition followed quickly. Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce invited Frank to speak at their quarterly luncheon, despite Kevin's membership in the same organization. Business success had created visibility that Kevin's influence couldn't suppress through whisper campaigns or professional sabotage. Frank's client base expanded beyond Ohio as satisfied customers referred him to business associates in neighboring states. Remote consulting capabilities allowed him to serve clients nationwide, transforming Richardson Digital Solutions from local service provider to regional consulting firm with national growth potential. The financial projections Frank had presented to Patricia Huang proved conservative rather than optimistic.
Monthly revenue exceeded his original estimates by 40%, while client retention rates approached 95% through his systematic focus on measurable results rather than flashy presentations. Standing in his expanded office space 6 months after opening day, Frank reflected on the journey from Kevin's brutal dismissal to community recognition as a successful entrepreneur. The grandfather who supposedly knew nothing about business had built something that generated both profit and professional respect. Success felt different than vindication. Rather than proving Kevin wrong, Frank had simply proven himself right about opportunities that age couldn't diminish when combined with determination and systematic preparation. The business thrived because it addressed genuine needs through competent service delivery, not because Frank had overcome age-related limitations that never truly existed.
Photograph smiled from his desk, reminding Frank of dreams they'd shared but never pursued during their years of practical responsibilities. Perhaps she would have been proud of this late career adventure that honored their suppressed entrepreneurial spirits while creating value for other business owners facing similar challenges. The phone rang with another client inquiry, another opportunity to demonstrate that business expertise transcended generational stereotypes. Frank Richardson had become exactly what he'd always been capable of becoming, once freed from other people's limitations on his possibilities. The Forbes magazine call came on a crisp December morning while Frank Richardson reviewed quarterly financial reports at his expanded office. Richardson Digital Solutions had grown from a single-room operation to a 3-person team occupying the entire ground floor of the renovated building on Main Street. Success had arrived faster and more substantially than even his most optimistic projections had predicted. "Mr. Richardson, this is Jessica Chen from Forbes magazine," the caller announced with professional warmth. "We're researching a feature story about innovative entrepreneurs over 65, and your name came up repeatedly during our interviews with business development professionals across the Midwest." Frank set down his pen carefully, processing the significance of this unexpected contact. Forbes represented the pinnacle of business journalism, the publication that defined entrepreneurial success for corporate America. Their interest in his story suggested recognition far beyond the regional acknowledgement he'd already received. "We'd like to include Richardson Digital Solutions in our upcoming cover story about late-career entrepreneurs who are revolutionizing traditional industries," Jessica continued. "Your approach to bridging generational gaps in business consulting has caught national attention among our sources." The interview process extended over several weeks, involving detailed financial documentation, client testimonials, and strategic analysis of Frank's unique market positioning. Forbes staff verified every claim, contacted multiple clients, and examined his business model with the thoroughness that characterized their investigative journalism. Frank provided complete transparency about his journey from factory supervisor to successful consultant, including Kevin's initial dismissal and subsequent attempts at sabotage. The Forbes team found his story compelling precisely because it demonstrated how family opposition could strengthen rather than weaken entrepreneurial determination. Meanwhile, Kevin Richardson's professional situation had deteriorated steadily since autumn. His attempts to undermine his father's business had created ethical conflicts within Meridian Corporate Solutions when several clients complained about inappropriate interference in their vendor selection processes. The company's investigation revealed Kevin had violated professional boundaries by using his position to pursue personal vendettas rather than client interests. Sarah Richardson called Frank in early January with news that carried both concern and inevitable justice. Kevin was terminated last week for professional misconduct. The severance package was minimal because of the circumstances surrounding his dismissal. Her voice reflected the strain of supporting a husband whose pride had destroyed his career prospects. Frank listened without expressing satisfaction or sympathy. Kevin's consequences stemmed directly from choices he'd made about how to respond to his father's business success. The termination represented natural results of unethical behavior rather than unfortunate circumstance beyond his control. "He's been applying for positions, but the industry is small and word travels quickly," Sarah continued. "Several potential employers have already heard about the ethics investigation. References from Meridian are lukewarm at best."
The Forbes article appeared in late February, with Frank's photograph prominently featured alongside 5 other entrepreneurs who had launched successful ventures after traditional retirement age.
The story positioned Richardson Digital Solutions as an example of how experience and determination could overcome age discrimination in competitive business environments. Richardson's systematic approach combines old-school business fundamentals with cutting-edge technological applications, the article stated. His client retention rate of 96% reflects the value of pairing deep operational experience with modern digital expertise. National recognition brought opportunities Frank hadn't anticipated. Speaking requests arrived from business conferences across the country. Consulting inquiries came from Fortune 500 companies seeking his unique perspective, and several universities invited him to develop curriculum for their entrepreneurship programs. The expanded visibility also attracted attention from potential investors interested in scaling Richardson Digital Solutions into a national consulting firm. Frank found himself evaluating acquisition offers and franchise opportunities that could transform his local business into a regional or national enterprise. Kevin appeared at Frank's office on a gray March morning, wearing a cheaper suit than his previous professional wardrobe and carrying the defeated posture of someone whose options had narrowed considerably. Linda announced his arrival with the cautious tone she'd learned to use when discussing family complications. "Dad, could we talk privately?" Kevin's voice carried none of its former condescension, replaced by careful humility that reflected his changed circumstances. He waited for permission to sit, demonstrating respect that had been absent from their previous encounters. Frank gestured toward the conference room where he met with high-profile clients, letting Kevin experience the professional environment he'd once dismissed as impossible. The space reflected success that could no longer be denied or minimized through skeptical analysis. "I came to ask for your help." Kevin began without preamble, recognizing that pride had become a luxury he couldn't afford. "I haven't been able to find work since the termination. Sarah is working part-time, but it's not enough to cover our expenses. The house is going into foreclosure next month." Frank studied his son's appearance, noting the physical signs of stress and financial pressure. Kevin had lost weight, his clothing showed wear that suggested careful economy, and his confidence had been replaced by desperate uncertainty about the future. "What kind of help?" Frank asked, though he understood exactly what Kevin was requesting. Employment, financial assistance, or intervention with potential employers who might overlook his professional misconduct in deference to Frank's growing reputation. "Any kind of work you might have available," Kevin replied, staring at his hands rather than meeting his father's gaze. "I understand business operations, client management, project coordination. I'm willing to start at entry level and prove my value through performance." Frank leaned back in his chair, considering the request from someone who had actively worked to destroy everything he'd built. Kevin's desperation was genuine, his need undeniable, but his past actions had created consequences that extended beyond personal embarrassment to professional destruction. "You called me a failure who knew nothing about business. You sabotaged my client relationships and tried to convince the bank I was mentally incompetent. You used your professional position to damage my reputation before I could establish credibility." Kevin nodded without attempting to defend or minimize his actions. "I was wrong about everything. Arrogant, jealous, and destructive. I destroyed my own career trying to prove you would fail when I should have supported your success." The admission carried weight that previous apologies had lacked. Kevin understood the full scope of damage he'd inflicted and accepted responsibility for consequences that were entirely self-created. But understanding didn't automatically generate forgiveness or obligation to provide assistance. "Why should I help someone who tried to destroy everything I worked to build?" Frank asked directly. Kevin had shown no mercy when Frank needed family support, demonstrated no loyalty when success seemed uncertain, offered no assistance when obstacles appeared insurmountable. "Because you're a better man than I am," Kevin replied, his voice barely audible. "Because family should mean something, even when some family members forget that temporarily." Frank stood and walked to the window overlooking Main Street, where other businesses thrived alongside Richardson Digital Solutions in Cedar Falls' revitalized downtown district. His success had contributed to community prosperity rather than merely personal achievement,
creating value that extended beyond individual profit. "I won't hire you," Frank said finally, turning back to face his son. "I won't provide financial assistance or professional references that might help you find other employment. The consequences you're experiencing are the natural results of choices you made." Kevin's shoulders sagged with final understanding that no appeal would change his father's decision. He'd burned bridges that couldn't be rebuilt through desperation or belated recognition of his mistakes. "I understand," Kevin said, standing slowly. "I brought this on myself, through pride and jealousy. I have no right to expect help from someone I tried to hurt." Frank watched his son walk toward the door, carrying the weight of consequences that would reshape his family's future permanently. Success had provided Frank with the luxury of choosing mercy or justice, and he'd chosen the path that honored respect over forgiveness.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.